All right. So
Uh,
tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community.
mm. Yeah, so my name is Dr. Jennifer Sarrett, and I use she, her pronouns. As a visual descriptor, I'm a white woman with shoulder length, dark brown hair. I'm wearing white glasses and I have on a orange t-shirt. I got involved in the disability community over 20 years ago. When I was in high school in the 90s, I took an AP psychology class, and in my textbook, there was just one little paragraph on autism, and something about it just really stood out to me. And I decided that's what I want to do. I want to work in the world of autism. And so I got my bachelor's in psychology. And while I was at college, I got my first job in the world of autism, being a home teacher for a young woman who was about a year and a half younger than me. And within 6 months, I was her lead teacher, and I got to choose what I wanted to do. So I wanted to do social skills, which is super hard to do and complex, but also super fun. We would go to restaurants and we took a pottery class and we just had a great time. Fast forward, I got a master's degree in special education with a focus on autism from Vanderbilt. And for that program, I ended up participating in what's called the Transatlantic Consortium on Early Intervention. And so it was European universities and American universities that would kind of take turns hosting classes. So I was lucky to go to Portugal for a class and went on a little field trip to observe an early intervention session in a Romani camp. And everything I knew about good interventions and data collection was thrown out the window. And that's when I first started thinking about the role of culture and disability and in autism. And so I got my PhD at Emory University in interdisciplinary studies. And that's where I really started studying disability studies, disability rights, disability advocacy, as I prepared for my dissertation, which compared parental and professional experiences of disability in Atlanta, Georgia, where I am from and live, and South India in the state of Kerala. And then I stayed on as a faculty member. I led the Disability Studies Initiative for a little bit. I taught a lot of classes about disability, and I shifted my research towards the end of my time at Emory to disability, intellectual and developmental disability in the criminal justice system. And then I left academia to be a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, where I like to bring an emphasis on anti-ableism and disability justice.
That's cool. So tell me a little bit about the work that you do. I understand that you have like a variety of hats as like an advocate, special educator, researcher, and among many others.
Yeah, I wear a lot of hats. I think, being trained as an interdisciplinary scholar, I really learned how to do, multiple things. So I really love social science research, interviews, surveys, that kind of thing. And I've done that in the past. And I'm able to take that passion and skills to DEI work, where I, work with organizations to assess their DEI needs through interviews and surveys and things like that. So that's really great. I really love teaching and presenting and public speaking. And so I'm able to do that also in my work as a consultant, where I provide workshops on various topics. But I don't have to grade any papers, which is a big benefit of not being in academia anymore. And so, yeah, and I really love thinking about new ways to communicate about access in a way that is non-threatening to people. And when I talk about access, of course, I'm, definitely relying on my history of disability related access and justice, but I expand that to other identities as well. Very intentional about thinking about intersectionality and things like that. So I've developed a framework I call Universal Design for Equity, which is a way of thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion that builds on the architectural concept of universal design. And I've given some workshops on that, and I've gotten some really great feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard about intersectionality before in one of my classes, so I'm very familiar with the term and the
Yeah.
concepts. Anyway, what are some of the stakeholders that you work with closely in the disability community?
Right now I'm working in the disability community, mainly an organization called Disability Solutions, where I'm advising, sort of taking a bioethics perspective on a project they're doing to increase the inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical trials. So I also have a bioethics background. And in addition to that, I'm involved with a working group called Break the Cycles of Disparities for Autism, where we're working on communications about racial inequities in autism and geographic inequities and class-related inequities and things like that. And then, of course, with my DEI work, while it's not necessarily a disability organization, I definitely integrate disability conversations into everything I do. I think that it's an identity that is just getting recognized in the world of DEI. And so it's really exciting that people are starting to really talk about disability more and think about access for people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. My next question is, what impact does your work have on the disability community?
I hope that my impact helps people understand that disability is part of the natural human condition and community, and that without disability inclusion, we're losing a lot of creativity. We're losing a really important perspective of the world, and really just trying to reduce the stigma of disability overall. And that goes for, when we talk about disability, a lot of people don't really know what that means if they don't identify with a disability, or if they are not involved in the disability community. And so we often think about disability and access as people with mobility disabilities, maybe sensory disabilities, but I'm talking about, psychiatric disabilities. I myself have a mental health disability. And, so in talking about even things like temporary disabilities and chronic illnesses, and by expanding people's perspective of what disability is, it helps people identify more with that social identity, and recognize that there is a lot of work to be done in order to improve their own lives and improve the lives of people that they love. So I'm really working to raise visibility of disability in our communities. I talk a lot about media representation and disability, and how powerful that can be and how damaging that can be. But I also talk about, being open and honest about our disabilities, and, not hiding our disabilities, and creating more community acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Lastly, what can people take away from your work? Like, because you talk a lot about inclusion, what can people take away? And also, I know this is I wrote it as one question, but how can companies sort of work towards that inclusion aspect of it? Because there's still a lot more work to do
Oh, yeah.
to get that done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, two main things. One, that disability inclusion is not as hard as people think. Most accommodations are $500 or less, and really include just a shift in perspective. The other thing is, I'd really like people to start thinking about my model of universal design for equity. And what this is, the benefits of this model, which I've written about, and you can read about it on my website, on the blog portion of my website, disruptiveinclusion.com. But universal design is an architectural concept that people developed in the 80s and 90s to build physical spaces and places to be as accessible as possible to as many people as possible without introducing barriers to anyone. So a great example of this is curb cuts, right? Those dips in the sidewalk that, help you go from the street to the sidewalk, originally designed for people with disabilities or who use wheelchairs, but are also helpful for people with carts or strollers or bikes or skateboards, all kinds of people. And so if we look at using this kind of framework for organizational culture and inclusion, it helps us be more proactive. Up until now, the field of DEI has been largely reactive, reacting to the Equal Rights Amendment in the 60s and Equal Employment Opportunity Act, reacting to George Floyd's murder, reacting to internal complaints, those kinds of things. But with the universal design for equity, you're being really intentional at the start and saying, okay, let's look at our policies. Where are they creating barriers for people in our organization? And when I lead people through this practice, it's not just about disability, right? It's about any identity. So in that way, it's also really good for attending to intersectionality. And by purposely designing organizational culture to be as inclusive as possible in this way, then you reduce the number of complaints and problems that you're going to have. You reduce the number of accommodations that people are going to require, and you just create a culture of acceptance and a communication to all of your employees that we want to make sure that this is a place that is anybody can be happy at. And so that's really, those are my two messages, is being really intentional about designing inclusive culture, and that doing so doesn't have to be incredibly burdensome, either economically or in terms of other types of resources.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's two important points.
Thank you.